Hey guys, it's Lucy from Craft Red Bush and welcome back. Today's lesson is the simple landscape using watercolor, of course, so I hope you enjoy. The first thing you want to do is find a reference photo. Pinterest is always a great place to look. Today we're going to be using art philosophy paints. I have the classics, which have the perfect palette just for everyday painting. And we're also going to be using the tropicals. I like the vibrancy on these colors. The paper that I'll be using today is Strathford Cold Press. I'm using the Zen Royal&Langnickel mop, 25 millimeters, the Noble 5/0 detail brush, the Noble 4 natural round brush, and the DaVinci Mop number 2. The first thing I did was tape a rectangular area onto my paper, and I used some old washi tape I had, but of course you can use some painter's tape as well. I'm taking my large mop brush and I'm just going to apply the water onto the paper. And this particular brush absorbs a lot of water, so I just removed a little bit of it. You don't want it to puddle too much. You do want the paper to be wet, but you don't want a large puddle onto the paper. And again, I'm just going to just about the middle of the rectangle. This is going to be the sky of our landscape. And I'm going to take some paper towel and I'm just going to dab some of that water off. And this is going to give you the illusion of clouds, which I will show you a little bit later. Just a closer look. I'm just taking off some of that extra water. And I'm going to grab my mop brush and I'm going to dip it in the gray and just a touch of the icy blue. And this is going to give me a very, very soft grayish blue, which I will go back into the wet water and just dab. And I'm just doing it in a very organic, random manner, leaving some of that white space. You want to make sure that your paint is really, really diluted, barely noticeable. Now I just want to show you a closer look at the dabbing of the paper towel onto the paint. You can see it just removes a little bit of that paint, and even though it's barely noticeable right now, we'll go back later on and add a little more paint just to give the clouds more shape. In the meantime, I'm going to dry this with a hair dryer because I want the paint to be dry but not completely dry. You want a little bit of moisture in there still. Now I went back and grabbed my mop number 2 and I'm just adding more water to the bottom half of the rectangle. And I'm going to go ahead and mix a little bit of the coconut and some of that tiki. And this is going to give me a nice warm color for the bottom. I'm just going to apply it and just do little dabs of the paint, and you can see that it's starting to spread upwards towards the water. So just spreading all that around all the way to the top, and the lighter areas will always be towards the top, because as we get towards the bottom, there's going to be a little more detail. So I'm just kind of spreading it and making it meet in the middle. Now I'm back and took a little bit of that parrot green color and I'm just dabbing it here and there. This just adds another color and another bit of interest, and now I'm going to start working on the mountains in the back, and I took some of that parrot, some palm and some tiki, and that creates a nice neutral green color that I'm going to use on the mountains. Now to paint the mountains, I'm just using very organic strokes and just with the tip of my brush pointing upwards and just moving it very randomly and giving it a very loose mountainous shape. And I'm just going to spread the rest of the paint towards the bottom and leave some white space here and there as well. And clean my brush, and then I'm going to go back. I just want to make sure that this is nice and mixed. I'm going to start working on another mountain towards the back, and I am of course looking at my reference photo. So we're starting very light, and we're going to be working on building layers. So now I'm going to take the hurricane, parrot, ocean, and tiki, and this should give me a nice darker green that I'm going to be using just to add again another layer of color to the painting. We're working primarily right now on a wet on wet technique. Just going to do the top of the mountains and just fill all that in. And working on those layers while the paint is still wet, so it's a nice bleed onto one and the other. Now you see how I've left a distinction between one mountain and the other hill, because I want to make sure that there's a little distinction there. I'm going to use the hurricane and the reef, which is a beautiful purple color, and this gives me even a darker shade. And I'm just going to go back, and while the paint's still wet, I'm going to add some of that darker color in there, here and there. And I'm just using a dabbing motion of my brush, and that just gives the painting some texture. And I'm just going to continue to dab my brush into the paint. I want to make it just a little darker. So I'm using this similar colors. I think this time we added reef to the mix. Just make it a tiny bit darker. And then I'll go back and just using the same motion with the brush. And you can see I'm holding my brush upright just so the tip gives it a thinner and more texture look. The paint, of course, is spreading because it's still wet, and the motion of the brush is what's creating all that beautiful texture, as you can see. Went back and added a little more of that reef just to make it a little bit darker. I want to start working on other areas of my painting, so I'm going to go ahead and use my hair dryer just to dry that. And again, you don't want it to be completely dry. still want a little bit of moisture in your painting. I'm mixing some coconut, some parrot, and I'm going to use this just to start giving the trees a little bit of a shape. And I always like to start with the lighter colors and then work my way towards the dark colors. And you can see there's a little bit of a split in my bristles, and this is how I know I need to go back and add a little more water. I'm going to go ahead and mix a darker green by using the island and some tiki. And I'm going to do the same organic movement with my brush. Just little dabs here and there, but still giving it somewhat of a shape. I'm changing my brush to a round number 4 because I want a little more detail, and I'm using the palms and the tiki, and this is going to give me yet another hue of green. And as you can see, my strokes are very organic, very loose. I want a lot of texture because I'm drawing all those little leaves on the tree. So I'm just going to continue and just keep doing these curly little lines here and there, giving the tree some shape. I go back and just to get a little more paint. And as the paint builds, it gets a little bit darker. And as you can see, I usually don't clean my brush in between because I want to make sure that it has all those beautiful different colors. I do go back and add a little more water just so I'm making sure that there's sufficient rhythm to the paint. And I'm just going to continue to do these little lines and giving the trees some shape. It's still very loose. I'm just drawing a bunch of little trees, different sizes, different shapes, all in the background. I'm just going to go here in the middle and just draw another little one here. And just varying the greens that I use because you want to make sure that there's a lot of interest, and just all the different hues add so much texture and so much interest to your painting as opposed to just using one color. Just going to draw a little one over here. It's a little family of trees. And watercolor is just so therapeutic when you turn on the music and just enjoy the process. I'm using some more water because by this time the paper has dried a little bit. So I'm just going back with some water just to make sure that I have that beautiful rhythm of the paint when it touches the water, and there's just a lot of movement. I'm going back to the other trees and adding that dark paint, and I usually look for the areas that I think would be in the shadow. And as you can see, the light in this particular photo, or my reference photo, is coming from the right. So of course my shadows and shading are going to be on the left hand side. I'm just going to continue to paint a series of trees. Now I'm going to go back and just remove a little bit of that paint off the right side, where again I said the light is coming from the right. So I'm just going back and removing some of that paint, and just I dip the brush onto the paint and then I dab it on my paper towel, and that just removes the paint quite easily. So you see I dab the brush on the paint, dab it on my paper towel, and this is just giving me those highlights that I need on the tree. So I'm just taking away some of that paint. Just in the areas I think I need some highlights, I'm going to go ahead and use my hair dryer just to dry the paint, and I'm going to be mixing a darker color just to add a little shadow on my trees. And you can see we're working from light to dark, because like I said on my previous video, it's always easier to add paint than to remove paint. So you always want to start light and work your way towards the dark. Now you can see slowly but surely the little trees are starting to take shape, and the entire landscape is already looking like a landscape. I'm now going to mix some sunset, reef, palms, and tiki. And I just want a darker color again, just a little bit darker than the previous ones. And again, I'm going to go back and just put little shadows just underneath where I think the darker areas of the tree might be. And this is where your reference photo comes in handy, because you can just take a look at where the shadows hit and where the light comes in and hits the trees. You can see how when you use darker paint, it really brings the trees to life. And I just go back and dab my brush in the water, and that really helps spread the paint. It just mixes it really nicely onto the paper. Just a little more water, a little more paint, and the trees are starting to form nicely. I think it's really important to make sure that when you're using your brush, you give your brush a lot of movement. The more movement that you use on your brush, the more texture that you're going to create onto your painting. And here again, I'm just taking away a little bit of that paint, and you can see that as I remove some of that paint, it just gives those pretty low lights and highlights onto the picture. Now I've changed my brush to the detail brush, and I'm just adding little trunks on the tree, just very tiny little ones. I go back with I went back to the round brush because I want to start adding a little bit of shade to the bottom of the trees. So I'm going to just take a little bit of that brown. I think I was using the coconut. Just doing a little detail at the bottom. It's barely noticeable, but it does give you a little more detail. You can see the little trunks. And now I'm just going to add a little bit of a shadow at the bottom of the trees. Again, the paint is very diluted, barely there, but it completely gives you that nice illusion of shade. I took some of that tiki again, and this time I'm just going to do very random lines, some parallel lines, vertical lines, and I took some water and I'm just going to dilute them. I'm going to do this again. This time I'm doing very quick vertical lines. And of course, this is the grass at the front of your painting. Here's a closer look so you can see. And again, it's very quick movements, very diluted paint, but it's still very noticeable. And I'm making sure that the grass goes one way and another way. Now the movements of my brush are very quick, but at the same time I'm adding very little pressure to the brush because I want to make sure that their lines are very thin and not a lot of pigmentation is on the brush. So super quick and very little pressure. I'm just building one on top of the next. I go back and grab a little bit of water just to make sure I blend them nicely. And I go back and I'm just going to add a little more shadows onto the tree. Now that they're a little bit drier, the dark shadows are going to be a little more noticeable and won't blend in as well. If you've noticed, most of the painting has been done with that dabbing movement of the brush. So that dabbing movement is really useful when you're creating foliage and mountains. Now it can take a toll on your brushes, so you want to make sure that you have plenty of water and that you're not doing it too hard, not too much pressure, so it doesn't hinder your brush too much. Now I'm going to go ahead and use some of the white that comes in the palette. I'm just going to do, again, a little more grass at the forefront of the painting. Now the white watercolor paint usually really melts into your picture, so you'll see that once it dries, it almost disappears. I'm just adding some in the back. Just very, very tiny little lines in the back. I'm just going to continue to do this. And you can see how close I'm holding the brush to the bristles, because that gives me a lot more control. And very, very light pressure and just tiny little strokes. And I'm just going to go back and add a little bit more of that darker brown onto the grass. I'm just building all the layers. Watercolor is all about layers and allowing the paint to dry in between. So while you're working on one side of the painting, allowing the paint to dry, you can work on the other side and vice versa. Or like you saw before, you can use the hair dryer to just expedite the drying process. And depending on what you're doing, you still want a little bit of moisture in your painting. Now, like I said before, the white watercolor usually disappears, as you can see. So I went back and I grabbed some white acrylic paint, and this one's really gonna stand out a little bit more. I'm just doing very few pieces of grass with this white paint. Just something to remember when you use white acrylic, or when you use acrylic paint on top of watercolor, oftentimes the watercolor is not going to cover the acrylic. Just the acrylic has it's just a higher concentration of pigments. Another thing is that I don't recommend you use your watercolor brushes with acrylic. Watercolor brushes are made specifically for watercolor, and acrylic is a little too harsh for the bristles. So make sure that you have designated brushes for each medium. Now we're just going to finish by adding a little more detail to the sky, and I went ahead and mixed a little bit of that gray and the icy blue, and I'm just dabbing it with my mop brush onto the sky and just adding those clouds a little more detail. Now I'm going to take a tiny bit of that blue and a lot of water, and I'm just going to again dab here and there. I'm going to take some water and make sure I mix some of that paint and just blend it in nicely onto the rest of the sky. And I think that's it. Now you're just going to let this dry a little bit, and then you can remove the tape, which to me is the best part of painting. And there you go. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you sign your artwork, and if you decide to paint your own, go ahead and tag me so I can take a look. If you have any questions at all, by all means, please leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed it. Consider giving this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time. Bye!